In the year 1220, travelers moving along the vast trade routes of Central Asia witnessed an eerie silence born from one of the greatest catastrophes in history. Where once stood the city of Merv, a center of science, art, and wealth, now the desert stretched endlessly, carrying only drifting ashes and stones bleached white under the sun. That silence was not just the silence of a city, but the silence of an entire civilization's grave. The Khwarazmian Empire, stretching from the Caspian Sea to the borders of India, was one of the richest and most strategic powers of the medieval world. Home to nearly 10 million people, its rulers saw themselves as the heirs of Alexander the Great and believed themselves invincible. Yet within only 3 years, this empire vanished from the map. Its destruction was not the result of decades of war or natural disaster, but a single insult. One fatal misstep, an act of diplomatic arrogance that turned all its glory into ash. The architect of this annihilation was Genghis Khan, and his response would forever change the meaning of total war in human history. By 1218, the world appeared to be at peace. Trade routes linking east and west carried not only silk, spices, and precious goods, but also ideas, technologies, and religions. In the eyes of the Khwarazmians, the Mongol Empire was nothing more than a distant people of the steppes, uncultured, uncivilized, and irrelevant. This underestimation would become one of the greatest mistakes in history at that time. The Khwarazmian Empire was the shining star of the Islamic world. Across lands stretching from the Sir Darya River to the Persian Gulf, from the shores of the Caspian to the mountains of Afghanistan, powerful cities flourished. Samarkand and Bukhara stood as centers of learning and culture, with armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, cities protected by massive walls and vast trade networks. The Khwarazmians believed themselves unconquerable. Their libraries housed thousands of scholarly works, and their palaces hosted the brightest minds and poets of the age. But this success bred a deadly arrogance among the Sultan and his court. Viewing the nomads of the steppe as uncivilized, the Khwarazmian elite dismissed the Mongols as a threat. To them, a people living in tents could never endanger an empire of cities and armies. This arrogance blinded them to the danger that was fast approaching. The Mongols, however, were not mere raiders. They were a new kind of power, masters of strategy, intelligence, and ruthless efficiency. After their recent conquest of the Kharutan, the Khwarazmians had become direct neighbors of the Mongols, but instead of seeing this as a threat, they saw it as an opportunity. Sultan Ala ad-Din Muhammad II was so intoxicated by his own power that he declared himself a second Alexander, even challenging the authority of the Abbasid Caliph and claiming divine legitimacy for his rule. Yet this confidence prevented him from recognizing the true nature of the danger gathering beyond his borders. The catastrophe began in the spring of 1218. Genghis Khan, seeking diplomatic and commercial relations, sent a large trade caravan. The delegation of around 450 people included Muslim merchants, Mongol envoys, and possibly intelligence agents. They carried gold, silver, silk, furs, and jade, symbols of immense wealth. The caravan could have been a herald of peace and prosperity between the two great powers. Believing that shared religion would build trust, Genghis Khan deliberately placed Muslim merchants in charge. The message was clear: the Mongols sought trade, not war. But Inul-Huk, the governor of the Khwarazmian frontier city of Otrar, and the Sultan's own uncle, greeted the mission with suspicion. Known for his greed and paranoia, Inul-Huk accused the caravan of espionage. Then he issued the fateful order that would change the course of history. All the merchants were to be arrested, and their goods seized. What appeared to be a simple security measure was, in truth, the empire's death sentence. Genghis Khan would interpret it not as an insult, but as a declaration of war, and his response would become one of the most brutal acts of vengeance the world had ever seen. The truth of these accusations remains a matter of debate among historians. In the Middle Ages, trade missions were often used for intelligence gathering as well, but what followed went far beyond any legitimate security concern. With the explicit orders of Shah Muhammad II, Otrar's governor Inul-Huk commanded the arrest and execution of the entire caravan, around 450 people. Their bodies were left to rot outside the city walls, while their valuable goods were confiscated and distributed among the governor's supporters. Only one camel driver managed to escape the massacre, fleeing east to inform the Mongol court of what had happened. This was no longer a case of simple banditry or a diplomatic misunderstanding. It was, in every sense, a declaration of war. According to the customs of the time, envoys and merchants were considered inviolable, protected as guests, regardless of religion or culture. Such a large-scale massacre was the gravest crime in interstate relations. What the Khwarazmians had done, under Mongol law, required not just retaliation but total annihilation. They had unknowingly set in motion a process from which there was no return. But when news of the massacre reached Genghis Khan's reaction was not an explosion of rage but a cold, calculated plan for vengeance. According to the Persian historian Juvaini, the great Khan withdrew alone to a hilltop for 3 days to contemplate his response. When he returned, his decision was final. The Khwarazmian Empire would pay for its crime with its very existence. Yet Genghis Khan made one final attempt at diplomacy. He sent a delegation of 3 envoys to the Shah, 1 Muslim and 2 Mongol, diplomats with clear and measured demands. The stolen goods were to be returned. Governor Inohuk was to be handed over for punishment. Responsibility for the massacre was to be acknowledged. If these conditions were met, the matter would be settled and peace was possible. But Shah Muhammad's response sealed his empire's fate. Instead of accepting the demands, he ordered the Muslim envoy beheaded and had the beards of the 2 Mongol envoys forcibly shaved before sending them back. In Mongol culture, a man's beard was sacred, and shaving it was one of the greatest insults imaginable. The return of the humiliated envoys sent a wave of fury through the Mongol court. Commanders wept with rage and demanded vengeance, while Genghis Khan reportedly declared, "The Sultan has chosen war, then war it shall be." There was now no turning back. What might have been resolved through diplomacy had become a war of honor. In the Mongol conception of warfare, the alternatives were total submission or total destruction, and Shah Muhammad, unknowingly, had chosen destruction. According to the Persian historian al-Nasawi, some advisors at court urged the Shah to reconsider, but he had been blinded by his own belief in his power. He boasted that his armies would drive the Mongol dogs back to the steppe, and that the barbarians would learn the price of challenging civilization. The people and the army shared this confidence, convinced that the war would be won quickly. The reality would be far more horrifying. In early 1219, the Mongol army rose from the east, a disciplined, swift, and deadly force, unlike anything the medieval world had ever seen. Genghis Khan mobilized an elite army of roughly 100,000 to 150,000 men. These were not mere raiders but professionals forged through years of training and ruthless selection. Each warrior traveled with multiple horses, enabling them to ride for days without rest and operate independently of vulnerable supply lines. The Mongol army's strength was not limited to mobility. They brought with them Chinese siege engineers and the most advanced military technology of the time, capable of breaching even the strongest Khwarazmian fortifications. Their first target was Otra, the scene of the original crime. Genghis Khan personally led the siege. This was not merely a strategic objective, but a symbol of Mongol justice. Inohuk and his defenders prepared for a long resistance, but the Mongols went beyond conventional siege tactics and launched a campaign of psychological warfare. They spread false reports exaggerating their numbers, used prisoners as human shields, and circulated stories that cities which surrendered were completely annihilated. These tactics shattered the defenders' morale. After 5 months of siege, Otra fell. It was not just the fall of a city, it was the beginning of the end for an entire civilization. The Mongols were no longer merely seeking revenge, they were preparing to erase the Khwarazmian Empire from the map. Governor Inohuk was captured alive and executed in a symbolic punishment for his greed. Molten silver was poured into his ears and eyes. The entire population of Otra, estimated at around 100,000 people, was systematically massacred. No one was spared, and the city was completely destroyed. This was only the beginning of the end for the Khwarazmian Empire. As news of Otra's annihilation spread, armies under the command of Genghis Khan's sons were already advancing toward the great cities of Bukhara and Sekh. An empire that had been so confident just months before was about to learn the true meaning of total war and the horrific price of insulting Genghis Khan. The siege of Bukhara, which began in early 1220, marked a turning point in the Mongols' policy of systematic destruction. Bukhara, one of the most important centers of Islamic learning and culture, had for centuries been the heart of the region with its libraries, madrasas, and bustling markets. But the Mongols approached it from an unexpected route. Genghis Khan led his army across the supposedly impassable Kizilkom Desert, appearing suddenly before the city walls. The defenders were terrified by this maneuver. The Mongols seemed to have appeared from the sky. On the third day of the siege, the city's garrison launched a counterattack, but the Mongols employed their classic feigned retreat tactic, luring them away from their defensive positions and annihilating them in open ground. With the main force destroyed, Bukhara's fate was sealed. When the city surrendered, its leaders expected the traditional terms of medieval warfare: tribute, submission, and perhaps the execution of a few officials. Instead, Genghis Khan delivered one of the harshest lessons in justice in history. In a speech to the gathered crowd, he declared, "Your Sultan has committed crimes against the Mongol people. Now you will pay the price for his arrogance." He then ordered the execution of all soldiers in the city. The civilian population was divided into categories. Artisans and craftsmen were sent to Mongolia as slaves. Young men were conscripted into the army, and the rest were either killed or enslaved. Bukhara's treasures were looted, its libraries burned, and its buildings demolished. Eyewitnesses spoke of scholars burned alive with their books and families torn apart. The city's great mosque was converted into a stable for Mongol horses. This destruction was not random brutality, but a meticulously planned policy of annihilation. The Mongols preserved only what was useful to them and destroyed everything else. All that remained was a ghost city and a terrifying warning. The fall of Samarkand, the jewel of the Khwarazmian Empire, revealed the full extent of Mongol power and the hopelessness of Khwarazmian resistance. As one of the empire's capitals and a key center of Silk Road trade, the city was reportedly defended by a garrison of 50,000 men, though modern historians believe this number may be exaggerated. Before approaching the city, Genghis Khan had already learned every defensive point and weak spot through the Mongols' sophisticated intelligence network. This information came not only from spies, but also from captured prisoners, who were interrogated and even used as human shields in later battles. The siege of Samarkand lasted only 5 days, but those 5 days demonstrated the complete superiority of the Mongol war machine. When the garrison attempted a sortie, they fell into the same trap as the defenders of Bukhara. The Mongols feigned a retreat, stretched their lines thin, and then turned back to slaughter the overextended forces. By the third day, half the defenders were dead. Shah Muhammad II twice attempted to send relief armies, but the Mongols anticipated his every move and repelled them with ease. This sent a clear message to defenders across the empire. Their sultan could no longer protect them. Samarkand surrendered on the 5th day, but Genghis Khan's orders showed that Mongol tactics had become utterly ruthless. Despite accepting the city's surrender, he commanded that every soldier who had taken up arms against him be executed. The civilian population was once again divided into categories. Artisans were enslaved, young men conscripted, and the rest faced death or deportation. Witnesses described families torn apart, treasures plundered, and buildings systematically demolished, a methodical apocalypse. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect was the speed of the city's destruction. One of the world's greatest cities was reduced to ashes in less than a week. The message was clear: if Samarkand could fall, no city was safe. The Khwarazmian Empire was not merely being conquered, it was being deliberately erased from the map. The flight and subsequent death of Shah Muhammad II symbolized the complete collapse of centralized resistance. The proud ruler who had once called himself the Second Alexander had become a fugitive, fleeing westward with a small retinue. Abandoning his throne and his empire, Genghis Khan dispatched his 2 most trusted generals, Subutai and Jeb, with a force of 20,000 men to capture the fleeing sultan. This pursuit became one of the most remarkable military operations of the Middle Ages. Despite operating far from their supply lines, the Mongol commanders advanced with astonishing speed and discipline, sweeping across the land like the wind and reminding all of the inevitability of death. Psychological warfare was just as critical as physical force. Subutai and Jeb demanded information on the Sultan's whereabouts from every city they passed through, warning that those who refused would share the fate of Bukhara and This strategy created a network of unwilling collaborators and ensured that Muhammad II could find no refuge anywhere. The Sultan's flight triggered panic throughout the empire. Realizing that their ruler could no longer protect them, provincial governors and local leaders began negotiating separate peace deals with the Mongols or simply abandoning their posts. Political authority collapsed rapidly. An empire that had seemed invincible just 2 years earlier was now crumbling militarily, politically, and psychologically. The final chapter came in December 1220, when Sultan Muhammad II died on a small island in the Caspian Sea, probably of pneumonia, though some historians suggest that the shock of losing his empire hastened his death. In his final days, delirious and despairing, he understood that his catastrophic mistakes could no longer be denied. The man who had insulted Genghis Khan died in exile, and his empire was now nothing more than a memory. The Sultan's death stripped the remaining resistance of all legitimacy. The Khwarazmian strongholds lost their coordination and will to fight. What had once been a vast empire was now just a scattering of isolated cities awaiting destruction. The Mongol generals did not pause to celebrate. They continued the systematic elimination of every pocket of resistance. But Muhammad's death was only the end of the beginning. His son Jalal al-Din would attempt to rally the remnants of the empire, leading to new campaigns and further devastation. The Mongols' work of total destruction was far from over. The erasure of Khwarazmian civilization would continue for months. In the final phase, the full extent of Mongol extermination capabilities became clear. Cities that had not yet fallen, Merv, Nishapur, Herat, and Urgench, faced a choice between immediate surrender or total annihilation. Most chose surrender, but even that no longer meant salvation. The massacre at Merv in February 1221 became infamous for its scale and systematic execution. This ancient city, known as the Pearl of the World, surrendered without resistance, hoping to avoid the fate of other Khwarazmian centers. Instead, its people suffered what contemporary sources describe as one of the most systematic mass killings in human history. Persian chronicles claim that over 1 million people were killed, though modern historians believe this figure is exaggerated. What made these final massacres so horrifying was their meticulous organization. The Mongols developed efficient systems for mass execution, dividing populations into manageable groups and assigning individual soldiers quotas of people to kill. At Merv, each Mongol warrior was reportedly ordered to kill hundreds of civilians. The killing continued for days as the Mongols systematically exterminated the city's entire population. Nishapur, the birthplace of the great poet Omar Khayyam, received special attention because a Mongol prince had been killed during its siege. Genghis Khan's daughter-in-law personally oversaw the city's destruction, ordering that no living creature be spared. Men, women, children, even animals were slaughtered, and pyramids of skulls were erected. Urgench, the empire's final major stronghold, resisted for 6 months and required Genghis Khan's personal involvement. Its strategic position on the Amu Darya River made the assault especially difficult, and the surviving Khwarazmian commanders fought desperately, knowing that surrender meant death. When the city finally fell, the Mongols diverted the river over its ruins to ensure it could never be rebuilt. By the end of 1221, the Khwarazmian Empire had effectively ceased to exist. The great cities that had once dominated the Silk Road lay in ruins. Libraries that had preserved centuries of knowledge were reduced to ash. Millions of people were dead, enslaved, or scattered across the world. In less than 3 years, an entire civilization had been erased from history. This destruction went far beyond a conventional military victory. The Mongols had not merely defeated a state, they had wiped it from history, leaving behind only a handful of survivors to tell the tale. In modern terms, it was one of the closest events to genocide in the medieval world. The annihilation of the Khwarazmian Empire sent shockwaves across the globe that reverberated for centuries. The sudden fall of such a powerful empire in such a short time shattered long-held beliefs about military power, diplomacy, and immunity. The consequences for the Islamic world were profound and lasting. The Khwarazmian Empire had been one of the most important cultural and intellectual centers of Islamic civilization. Its destruction was not merely a political catastrophe, but a cultural disaster that set back Islamic learning and scholarship for generations. Libraries filled with priceless manuscripts were destroyed, scholars were killed or enslaved, and entire intellectual traditions were lost forever. The demographic consequences were equally devastating. The region's population is believed to have declined by as much as 90%. Cities were abandoned, irrigation systems collapsed, and nomadic pastoralism replaced settled agriculture across vast areas. The region would not regain its pre-invasion population levels for centuries.